Hey, so I just bought a Jaguar XF, and while planning to do an ownership video and review for anyone considering buying a used Jaguar, I couldn't help but keep thinking of the way that Jaguars used to look. The smooth, plush curves, the four round headlights, the unmistakable cues of British styling and posh elegance. When I was just a wee kid, I remember that the first cars to ever catch my attention were the X-Types and the XJs of the early 2000s. They looked like no other car on the road at the time, and really, there's still little else on the road that really looks quite like a classically styled Jaguar. But in 2009, Jaguar was acquired by Tata Motors from the Ford Motor Company, and under their direction, and a massive wallop of new investment, Jaguar's sedan line made a radical departure from their previous styling, and at first glance, it appeared as if Jaguar lost their character and their prestige in what appeared to be an attempt to modernize and chase the coattails of the more bankable names of BMW, Audi, and Mercedes-Benz. But, interestingly, after a closer inspection of the new XJs, XFs, and XEs, I couldn't help but notice striking similarities between these cars and the cars of Jaguar's past, with slanted eyes and bulging hoods and widened grills that seemed to harken to the XKR GT sports cars, which themselves were stylistic evolutions of the E-Types from yesteryear. And of course, there's that square grille that looks like it's from an XJ of the 1960s. Jaguar didn't quite rid themselves of their old cues after all, rather they simply decided to make everything look like their more sporting offerings, while leaving the more upscale posh design cues in the past. Why did they do this? Who was responsible? Was it the right move? Well, my name is Austin and you're watching Veloce Midwest, and together let's peel back the layers of Jaguar's styling history to see how we went from this to this. First off, as always, a little history. The roots of Jaguar go back to the 1920s when a pair of Brits named William Lyons and William Walmsley started the Swallow Sidecar Company, a small Lancashire-based maker of motorcycle sidecars. When Walmsley sold his shares, Lyons took over and went into the car business, making the SS Jaguar, apparently preferring the name of a different cat as opposed to his near namesake. The Jaguar car proved successful enough that, eventually, Jaguar became the brand name. Jaguar got down to business quickly, making eye-catching luxury sports car after eye-catching luxury sports car, with perhaps the most famous classic examples being the XK and E-Type cars, with the latter being one of those classic rail cars that reportedly made even Enzo Ferrari jealous. Around this time, Jaguar also began making luxury passenger saloons, or as we call them in the States, sedans. Ultimately, a mix of posh, upscale sedans and stylish sports cars would become Jaguar's bread and butter for the next several decades, and for a time Jaguar was relatively comparable to the more upscale Bentleys of its time. As Jaguar grew, they decided to buy the Daimler Motor Company from a small arms company as well as a matching factory from the same company, and began to use the Daimler name for their more prestigious luxury sedans, sort of like how Mercedes-Benz has the Maybach name, or how Chrysler tried to market the Imperial name, or how Mercedes used the Daimler name themselves, albeit a different company with the same name. It's a different story. However, during the 1960s, Jaguar's material supplier was purchased by the British Motor Corporation, and Lyons ultimately decided to merge with them, thus ending Jaguar's independence. Later on, Jaguar's new parent was merged with Leyland Motors under pressure from the British government. Due to subsequent poor management, the Jaguar name suffered, and by the beginning of the 1980s, quality control, as well as the quality of seemingly all British cars, just simply wasn't there. But then, somehow, Jaguar found its way to independence once more and began being traded on the stock exchange under its own name. Quality control improved over other British makes at the time, and the company was relatively successful again by the 1990s. In 1999, the Ford Motor Company, having failed to build their own brand of Euro-styled cars in the United States under the short-lived Merkur name, bought majority shares of Jaguar, in addition to shares of fellow British automakers Land Rover and Aston Martin, as well as Swedish automaker Volvo. Ford's plan was to redevelop these brands and more heavily market them in the United States as a set of premium European motorcar brands to basically serve as a competitor to the likes of German rivals BMW and Mercedes-Benz. Ford expanded the brand by refining the XJ series of sedans and having Jaguar and Aston Martin share platforms for new GT cars. Additionally, Ford used their Mondeo platform to create the X-Type, a new entry-level model meant to attract younger buyers to the brand with a lower price, as well as act as a volume seller to make Jaguar more profitable. Later, they added the S-Type, a sportier BMW 5 Series competitor that, in addition to base models, featured high-performance specialty models like the S-Type R. However, under Ford's ownership, despite their best efforts, Jaguar just simply failed to turn a profit, and eventually Ford sold its control of Jaguar to the Indian group Tata Motors in 2008, who combined Jaguar and Land Rover into a single British registered company. Since then, Jaguar has added SUVs to their line and have downsized their sedan segment. In addition, they introduced their first electric car, the I-Pace, and Jag plans to have an all-electric lineup by the year 2025, plus a higher level of quality comparable to that of Bentley. And that pretty much catches us up on Jaguar's history. However, we're talking about the styling here. And when I think of Jaguar motor cars, the first thing that comes to mind is a large or mid-size sedan with smooth curves and long body lines, chrome accents, a leaping cat hood ornament, 4 round headlights. I think of plush seating surfaces wrapped in leather and fancy wooden interior accents. I think of something very posh and upscale, something very stately, something rather, unreliable. And I think of something that is unmistakably British. 4 eyes and a panther was basically one of the brand's biggest signifiers, almost as noticeable and as quickly identifiable as Alfa Romeo's Scudetto, or BMW's kidney grills, or Rolls-Royce's Spirit of Ecstasy even. At one point, this design language was pretty much the entire brand image, with the XJ line of sedans essentially being one of the most recognizable British cars to the American public. Although, with that said, it wasn't Jag's only look at any given point. Generally speaking, this design was primarily reserved for their saloons, while their sports cars usually took on different, sometimes more experimental looks. The sedan design language, however, can be traced back quite far. During the 1930s and 1940s, it generally wasn't uncommon for cars to feature 2 primary headlights along with a smaller pair of ancillary light pods usually attached to the front bumper or sometimes the front fenders. Jaguars, of course, followed suit. As design marched forward, these smaller pod lights generally became incorporated into the design better. Some cars adopted side-by-side lights, some adopted lights stacked on top of each other. Technically speaking, we often see this today still, only that now the bulbs are simply under a single headlight housing or sometimes disguised with fancy structures or LED daytime running lights. Jaguar's particular look, though, seemingly began back with the somewhat confusingly named Mark V Saloon. Confusing in the sense that there was no Mark 1 through 4 model and that there had been at least 8 saloon variations beforehand. Nonetheless, the Mark V featured 4 large headlamps slightly stacked on top of each other. The car was designed by a team led by William Lyons. With the Mark VII, the headlamps, now stacked, were fully integrated into a new, more streamlined body. The large curves of the fenders and the high beltline made its way into the smaller Mark I saloon, which arrived in 1955, and this body design actually showed up in the sporty XK coupes. Meanwhile, the E-Type coupes took on a rather unique look of their own, with different body lines, different style of headlights, and a wide oval-shaped grille. With the arrival of the E-Type, there's now a clear distinction between Jaguar's passenger cars and their sportier offerings. And for this period of time, these cars became Jaguar's distinct look. Now, as I really briefly mentioned before, that for the most part, Jaguars and Jaguar Daimlers were relatively similar to the other British luxury offerings of the time from Rolls-Royce and Bentley, but they seemingly had a more of an added focus on performance over complete luxury. Royce and Bentley, for example, had little at the time that could be considered competition for the E-Type, with the Mark I debuting for 1955 and the E-Type for 1961, and with the XK coupes in between. The 50s and the 60s had a very distinct personality for Jaguar, which were these posh, upscale leather, wooden luxury, and heavily curved sedans and bullet-shaped sports cars, but all with a more of an appeal to driving than the more chauffeur-oriented Rolls-Royces and Bentleys. Yet, despite how most of the range looked, Jaguar also had something a little different for the 60s, the Mark X. Once again, designed by William Lyons-led team, the headlights shifted to a side-by-side design and gave the face a wider waterfall-style grille that was comparable to the grilles from Bentley. What were becoming more typical sedan styling cues for the time, such as longer trunks, were adopted by the Mark X, although it still maintained a similar high beltline design similar to the previous saloons. By 1966, Jaguar introduced the 420 sedan, a new high-end saloon with an even more prestigious Daimler variant that would go on to define the brand's visual presence for decades to come by carving the design language of the Mark X into stone. With the debut of the flagship XJ sedan for 1968, which added a larger, more distinct grille, this new design language began to dominate their model range. Eventually, the XJ phased out all other saloons and began to serve as Jaguar's dominant luxury model, and was given a full range of engines ranging from their bread-and-butter inline 6s to an extravagant V12. The E-Type continued until 1974, receiving only minor changes to its grille design. For 1975, the E-Type was replaced by the new XJS Grand Touring car. This was initially designed by Malcolm Sire, but he passed before his design work can be completed. The aerodynamic XJS largely served as an evolution of the E-Type, having some similar lines and an overall similar silhouette. And like the E-Type, the XJS was available as both a coupe and a convertible. Initially though, the only engine choice was a V12, although different inline 6 engines would be introduced later. For the most part, Jag saloons and sport GT cars remained rather separate in their individual identities. The XJ eventually received a smaller grille for the Series 3 introduced in 1979. And the grille continued to get smaller in the coming decades, creating a somewhat more defined shape. Under Ford's ownership, they introduced a smaller X-Type sedan and wagon, which heavily borrowed from the XJ in design cues, and which was then followed up by the S-Type, which aimed to be a sportier alternative to the XJ and X-Type and compete more directly with the BMW 5 Series. The S-Type featured somewhat different styling, trying to look sleeker and younger while simultaneously borrowing design elements from the Jaguars of the 1960s, namely the design of the grille and the continued use of the leaping Jaguar hood ornament. For the 1997 model year, Jaguar introduced the XK8 Sports Grand Tour, which actually backtracked a little and went for a smoother, bullet-shaped design that looked much closer to an evolution of the E-Type than the XJS ever did, in my opinion anyways. A wide oval grille, single-piece headlamps, and a torpedo design, all this added to the XK8 were heavily borrowed headlamps and bulges in the hood. Vertical ornamentation, which were bumpers on the E-Type, were now purposeful elements of the front fascia of the XK, seemingly creating the image of a snarling Jaguar. As it happened, the design dated back to the 1980s from a concept jointly created by designers from Jaguar and Aston Martin. In fact, the platform of the XK8, which was derived from the XJS, was shared with Aston Martin for their DB7 Grand Tour. Meanwhile, Jaguar continued to play fast and loose with the design languages on their high-end sports cars, namely the XJR15 and the XJ220. Both of which seemingly borrowed some commonality with the XK8's front end, albeit only barely and certainly subject to argument. For the XK8's second generation, also known as the X150, design work was taken over by former Ford and Aston Martin designer Ian Callum, marking his debut with Jaguar. The angry eyes were gone, replaced by a front fascia more reminiscent of the 1953 XP11 racing prototype and the D-Type, while the grille and overall proportions of the car still evoked the E-Type. The sedans and GTs, though, were still very distinct from each other. But now, this was all about to change. In 2009, Ford finalized a sale with Tata Motors, and Jaguar changed hands once more. With this came a new XJ and replacements for the X and S types, the XF and the XE. And suddenly, Jaguar had a very different design language. The bodies became more streamlined, more regular looking. The posh British luxury look was replaced with sleek lines and a sportier exterior more reminiscent of an Audi or BMW, which were now very clear rivals. The XJ, while always a unique looking alternative to the Mercedes-Benz S-Class, now actually kind of resembled one in scale and shadow. The XE and the XF replaced the X and S types, respectively, and those more classical Jag designs were also dropped in favor of something less obviously British looking and something that looked more like a head-to-head fight with Audi. Ian Callum handled this entire refresh as well, and they did at least still look elegant while being more aggressive as well. And to Callum's credit, while Jaguar's design made a massive shift, and to their original clientele, one could argue Jag lost its most defining identity, there were at least some callbacks to the Jags of old hidden on the new cars. Most notably, the grille design, which was highly reminiscent of the late 60s XJ. Angrier looking headlights were clear callbacks to the XK8 of the 90s, as were the hood lines on the XF sedan. And for the final generation of the XJ, which was discontinued after 2019, the headlights, while under a single housing unit, featured separate bulbs spaced out and separated by LED daytime running lights, creating the impression of the four-eyed Jags of generations past. The classic Jaguar elements were there, but now they're just that much more subtle. So there's your lengthy history on Jaguar and the evolution of their styling. But the question I was asking was, why did they change? After all, the four-eyed posh look was one of the brand's most defining traits, perhaps just as physically identifiable as Alfa Romeo's Scudetto or BMW's kidney grills. As it happens, the answer might lie in one of the words I just used to describe Jaguar's aesthetic: posh. As it happens, it's possible that the reason for such a drastic styling change was it was too formal. Because it was too, "Alright lads, let's retire to the cigar room for smoking brandy." And beyond that, I've found that among the people of the middle-aged group around today, Jaguars seem to be collectively referred to as old people's cars, especially if we're talking about the older styling cues. And although sure, a lot of cars in Jag's bracket can be considered old people cars, given they usually have the better funding to purchase such a car, younger people with similar access to that kind of money always seem to go more for the likes of a BMW or a Mercedes. Or hell, even Maseratis tend to be seen in the hands of somewhat younger clientele. Before I bought my XF, I was actually thinking about going older and cheaper with an X-Type, and upon bringing it up to the family, aside from concerns of reliability, they couldn't help but bring up the fact that it was an old guy's car. A Jaguar? That's for old people. They think the same thing of Buicks, by the way, which has been an image Buick's been fighting somewhat unsuccessfully for decades in the US. And I'll admit, when I see Jags, especially the older styling, they are usually being driven by people around my grandfather's age. Newer Jags are almost always in the hands of exceptionally younger people. It seems this old money styling wasn't quite working for Jag sales either, as Ford never was able to turn a profit from their ownership of the company. After the Tata buyout, it was the aforementioned Ian Callum who set out on the new face of Jaguar, beginning with the design of the new XF, which was based on the S-Type's platform. Callum felt that he needed to bring Jag into a modern era by modernizing the car by a rather hefty degree, and likely bring it in line with the styling of its German and Italian rivals. Callum led Jag design up until 2019. He started with the 2006 design of the second generation XK Sports Coupe, and after that he went to the XF, and after that he went to the flagship XJ, which he designed to be sportier looking than the posh outgoing model, and in his own words, and I completely apologize for a second attempt at a very bad British accent, "I wanted to establish the face with a brand identity. It was time for a change." Ooh, that was bad. Oh boy. I should cut that out. That just no, too late now. Well, I guess it's too late. Thus, the rather square grille, which we called the first generation XJ, was born, and that, with angry first-gen XK-like headlights and eyebrows, save for the first XF, which had a more rounder-looking thing, you had this new kind of combination of classic styles paired with slicker body lines and coupe-like roofs. Jaguar DNA was still there, but it had modernized and taken on some of the design trends of its competition. Mind you, I will admit that it can be hard to keep an entire design for so long. After all, while I mentioned the Alfa Scudetto and the BMW kidneys, the grille influences were the only things that those two brands kept. The rest of those cars kept changing to stay competitive, and even the Scudetto and the kidneys occasionally changed shape and dimension to fit with the new design trends. Jaguar was getting pretty long in the tooth, with the S-Type being the only real attempt to modernize the entire styling, and even that was more of a retro design. Although it's sad to see such classic, beautiful styling leave, and many brand loyalists were just as divided, Jaguar wasn't doing well with sales, and Callum seemed to have the right idea. And admittedly, while very different, the new design language is still quite nice. It does have some of the understatedness of Audi, but the new Jags, such as my XF, have some subtly beautiful line work all the same. It's one of those cars that looks a bit common at first, but then it keeps bringing you in and letting you catch more and more little details. I quite like it, actually. And I'll argue that they're well above any of the Germans right now, save maybe for Audi and Mercedes' more hardcore offerings. And when compared to my Italian benchmarks, I think the Jags fare quite nicely. Perhaps not as quite stop dead in your tracks, but a more relaxed attractiveness that gently invites you in to explore its subtleties, if you're willing to get intimate. And that about really sums it up. Stylings change, and when a single style defines your entire brand image, you can really only stretch it so far. Could they have kept it and tried to have pushed it further? Maybe. After all, even today, the X and S types look rather modern on the outside. I think so anyways. But even so, they weren't selling as well as they could have been, which means that they could have failed if they didn't dramatically shake things up. Someone else we could look at is Mercedes-Benz, who for a time offered a somewhat similar looking front fascia to Jaguar for their CLK and E-classes of the 1990s and early aughts. At one point, they attempted to keep the 4-eyed look, but they made them rectangular rather than round, and ultimately for the next generation of cars, the look was just dissolved completely. It wasn't hip enough for young trophy wives and middle-aged businessmen who believe that 60 was the new 50, and when Mercedes drops a trend, the rest of the auto world usually takes notice. Jaguars still look good. While sleek and sporty, it still managed to pick up an air of class, yet managing to look two ways at the same time, whereas the old XJ could hardly ever be said to look sporty. Sure, many argue it's too understated, and Lincoln seemingly copying Jag's newer look hasn't helped any, but they've been making it a bit different looking again, and it still looks quite good, especially on their I-Pace electric car. Speaking of, Jaguar is looking to go all electric, and furthermore, they want to approach Bentley levels of luxury and exclusivity. How they plan to do this is anyone's guess, though it looks like they've started by shutting down their stores in order to be harder to get, I guess. And also the I-Pace is getting a little dated right now, and the F-Type is being discontinued, and the electric XJ replacement was just cancelled altogether. But who knows? As Jaguar continues to grow into a new segment, they may create something that's really new and really interesting, maybe even some limited run cars. It's just a guess, really, but it's not outside the realm of Bentley to do, or Mercedes, so Jag might try it. Maybe we'll see the old design in a limited throwback, and who knows? It seems that, at least according to this guy's channel, the older Jags are starting to fall into the hands of younger car enthusiasts looking for interesting, unique, and uncommon cars to drive around, which means that maybe years down the line, there could be a nostalgic demand for the older Jag styling. Who knows what the future will bring for Jaguar? Their new business model could work as other makes are looking to prioritize the selling of more expensive, higher margin cars to make more short-term profit. And while I could take another video to argue why this isn't a really good idea in my opinion, I'll admit that for Jaguar, it might be what they need to keep the lights on, which right now is something that Land Rover is kind of doing for them. Although I'm hopeful, I feel that Jaguar still has a way to go before being all that relevant again. But regardless, they've certainly made and are still making some very good-looking cars. And that's what this is all about. Thanks for watching. Hey, once again, a really big thank you to everyone for tuning in. If you like this video, please hit that like button for me. If you want to stay tuned for whatever I have next, how about clicking that subscribe button for me and tapping that bell while you're at it. Share with your friends, show your family members, tell your dog, and don't forget to check out my Instagram where you'll find car spotting, pictures of local shows and events, and my poorer attempts at more serious photography. Thanks again, and remember to stay tuned, you and your cars. Oh, that's a terrible line. Let's just...